Okay, earlier today I did a video on how it's a complete and total fraud for the government to be charging the Americans with failure to file a Form 1040. It simply is a complete and total fraud, a misapplication of the law. It's enforcing obedience to the government and not constitutional taxation. So I thought making that claim in a short, probably we ought to address it and go through it with the statutes and the other items from law that give us the understanding that this is a complete and total fraud. And it is based in the statute. So let's look at that. Let's switch over to the desktop. First thing we're going to look at is Section 1, the tax imposed. And what we, of course, see is that there is hereby imposed on the taxable income of every married individual or every surviving spouse or heads of households and so forth. The point is, it's a tax imposed on taxable income. This doesn't impose a tax on any person per se, and therefore it can't create a filing requirement in anybody's name. So, what do we know about the filing requirement? Well, we come over here and we see IRS Notice 609. This is the notice, your Privacy Act notice of your rights that they are required by law to give to you, and they send you a copy of this with almost all of the correspondence that you receive, at least they're supposed to. And this gives us our first hint about what's going on, where it says right here that you must file a return or statement with us for any tax you are liable for. Your response is mandatory under these sections. Okay, so any tax that you are liable for, you have to file. So where are you liable? We saw that Section 1 imposed a tax on taxable income, but that doesn't make anybody liable for the tax. And we're going to come back in a minute and look at these, but let's jump over here. Let's go see if we can find the statute that Notice 609 is based on. Okay, here it is, one of them. Section 6001, Notice of Regulations requiring record statements and special returns. Yeah, I wonder what's special about it. Let's see. Every person liable for any tax imposed by this title or for the collection thereof shall keep such records, render such statements, make such returns, and comply with such rules and regulations as the Secretary may from time to time prescribe. So here we see the first indication of why Notice 609 says you must file a return for any tax that you are liable for. Here's the statute. Every person liable for any tax. Is there another one? Yes, there is. The next statute the IRS claims says you have to file is 6011, and here it is. General requirement of return statement or list. And again, we see that A, the general rule is hinged upon, when required by regulations prescribed by the Secretary, any person made liable for any tax imposed by this title, or with respect to the collection thereof, shall make a return or statement according to the forms and regulations. So here again, we see that the requirement to file a return is predicated by the statutes on the condition of being a person liable for tax. Now we come over here, we'll look at the last one, 6012, persons required to make returns of income. A, returns with respect to income taxes under subtitle A shall be made by the following. Then it lists every individual having taxable income, but you can't skip down here to gross income and how much and who's exempt. You got to focus on this first sentence, subtitle A. You need to be liable for tax under subtitle A, right? 6001 says liable, 6011 says liable, 6012 says subtitle A. So who's liable for tax in subtitle A? Well, let's go look at that. Who's liable for tax in subtitle A? Wasn't that the, it was down below, not up above. Okay, let's run down here. Okay, here are the statutes for liability of tax. 7501, liability for taxes withheld or collected. Here are the liability statutes for the estate tax, the FICA tax, the railroad retirement tax, employment tax, the auto excise, the luxury, the heavy trucks and trailers, the tire manufacturer, the manufacturers, the tax on wages, the occupational tax, the vehicle use, the petroleum, the chemicals, failure to satisfy continuous coverage, certain group plan requirements, plan reducing benefit accruals, distilled spirits, wine bulk, beer bulk, tax on tobacco, purchase, states who made liable, 1461 states who is made liable for the payment of the federal income tax withheld by the withholding agent under Subtitle A. Remember, Subtitle A, you got to be liable? And look who's liable. Here it is. Liability for withheld tax. Every person required to deduct and withhold. It's the withholding agents, the tax collectors, created in 1913 as a class of collectors to administer to the collection of the tax at the source. And the withholding agents, as you recall from my other videos, are only authorized and only allowed to withhold money from non-resident aliens and foreign corporations. And they're the parties made liable for the tax. And look, tax paid by recipient. If the withholding agent doesn't collect the tax from the non-resident alien, and he fails to deduct and withhold, but thereafter the tax is paid, they collected it from the non-resident alien somehow, then the tax so required to be deducted and withheld shall not be collected from such person who failed, the withholding agent, but this section shall in no case relieve that person, such person, the withholding agent, the collector, from liability for interest or penalties. So it's not even the non-resident alien liable for the interest and penalties. It's the tax collector, the withholding agent, who failed to collect it. And look, 32 years later, they did the same thing in Subtitle C. The employer shall be liable for the payment of the tax required to be deducted and withheld. So in each case, it's the collector who is liable. And remember 6001 and 6011? Liable for the tax or the collection thereof. Here's 6011 with respect to the collection thereof right here. 6001 said the same thing. 6001 with respect to the collection thereof, made liable for the tax or with respect to the collection thereof. So here we see it all playing out. The liability for tax under Subtitle A is in the name of the withholding agent who is required to collect the tax only from non-resident alien. You want to look at that real quick? Let's come up here and look at that real quick. 7701. Bang, go down here to A16, withholding agent. The term withholding agent, oops, not too far. Here it is, right here. Can I make that scroll just a little bit? Jumping too much. Withholding agent. The term withholding agent means any person required to deduct and withhold any tax under the provisions of 1441, 1442, 1433, or 1461. 1461 we just saw. That says the withholding agent is liable for the taxes collected from the persons under these sections. So let's look at them. 1441. Withholding of tax on non-resident aliens. And notice down here in subsection B that dividends, rent, salaries, wages, premiums, compensations, these are all taxable items when earned by a non-resident alien. But salaries and wages aren't in section 61. Gross income defined, look. Here you've got compensation, fees, commissions, fringe benefits, but salaries and wages are gone. They're removed. It's only the salaries and the wages of the non-resident alien that are subject by law to the collection of the tax, not citizens. That's why they need your permission to collect it on a W-4 employees withholding allowance certificate. 1442, the next code section cited in the authority of the withholding agent. He collects tax from foreign corporations. 1443, he collects his tax from foreign tax-exempt organizations at a slightly lower rate. And 1461, the last code section, liability for withheld tax. The withholding agent is liable for the tax, and he's the person required under Subtitle A to file a tax return because he's the person made liable for the collection of the tax, and the requirement to file a return reaches not only those liable for the tax, but those responsible for the collection of it thereof. Now, in addition to all of this, we have the problem, of course, that Form 1040 isn't the form listed in law as being required under Section 1, the section that imposes the tax. So look at that right here. Here we go. This is Code of Federal Regulations, Section 602.101, Paperwork Reduction Act, control numbers under the Paperwork Reduction Act, where every form was assigned a unique OMB document control number. They're right here. And those document control numbers control what information can be collected under law. So here we are in the table. Here's the code section that imposes the tax. Part 1, Chapter 1, Section 1, tax imposed. The form required, the document OMB control number. The OMB document is 1545-0067. There's only one listed. If there were more than one, well, 126 requires more than one. They're all listed. So if there was more than one, it would be listed. This is the only form required. It bears this number. So here it is, right? Oh, whoops. The 1040 has a different number. 0067 is the required form. But 0074 is the OMB document control number on the form. It's not the form required by law as listed in the law. This is from 1993. They removed all the entries in the year 2000, and now you can't look up in the law what form is required, but they can't get rid of this history. And anyone can go to the law library and duplicate this by just pulling up the historical records recorded on the fiche records at the law library if the books don't go back that far. So here's the form. Now, what's the form that's actually required? Here it is. 0067, that's what's listed in the law. Foreign earned income, Form 2555, for use by citizens and resident aliens. It was never a domestic tax. It was originally imposed under the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act of October 3rd, 1913. It's the original legislation the income tax was enacted under. A tariff is one form of an impost, which is one of the three forms of indirect taxation authorized by the Constitution under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, made enforceable at law by the original enabling enforcement clause of Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. But imposts only tax foreign activity, foreign persons who the withholding agents collect the tax from, in foreign places like territories and possessions, on foreign imports from goods imported from foreign nations and sold here, and like in foreign nations under a tax treaty. So impost only taxes foreign persons, foreign activity. That's why the withholding agent only collects the tax from non-resident aliens. That's why they had to create a whole new class of tax collectors in 1945, the employer. The withholding agent is bound by law, required to collect tax from all non-resident aliens that they do business with. And every person in the country is a withholding agent, potentially, if you do business with a non-resident alien. The employers are only allowed to collect tax from people who give him permission to do it on a W-4, or who are one of the non-resident aliens subject to the collection of the tax on their salaries and wages. Because then the employer would be acting in a dual capacity, both as an employer and as a withholding agent. He has an additional responsibility with respect to dealing with the non-resident alien individual. The form required is not the Form 1040. It's 2555. It's a foreign tax. It's never been a tax on your salaries and wages. It's always been a foreign tax. And there's another video that addresses the problem of Section 61, which wasn't part of the original legislation in 1913. It was enacted 5 years later under the Canadian Tax Treaty that lasted for 75 years and expired in 1993 without Congress ever giving any further legislative enactment to Section 61 beyond the terms of the original treaty, which means when the treaty expired in 1993 and was replaced with NAFTA, Section 61 became dead letter law. It no longer has any application to anything, anywhere, or anybody. Its use, gross income, is completely fraudulent, just like this failure to file, which we're going to get back to right now. So, what happens next? You're supposed to be liable, you're not. They say you owe a Form 1040, you don't. What's supposed to happen if you don't file a return that you're supposed to file according to the law? Well, let's go look at Section 6020B. Here it is, 6020B, execution of return by secretary. Authority of secretary to execute return. If any person fails to make any return required by any Internal Revenue law or regulation made thereunder at the time prescribed therefor, or makes, willfully or otherwise, a false or fraudulent return, the secretary shall make such return from his own knowledge and from such information as he can obtain through testimony or otherwise. Well, what do you know? There is a statutory requirement to file a tax return. And it's not laid on the citizen, it's laid on the secretary. The secretary is required by law to file the return for the person from the information they have available. If the person doesn't like it, they can file their own version of it. But since they failed to do so, the secretary can file the return. In fact, the secretary is required to file the return. And this is the only statute that exists anywhere in Title 26 or in the statutes of the code that require a return to be filed by a particular person. So if you fail to file a Form 1040, you can't be charged with failure to file because there's no statute that requires you to file it because you're not the person liable and it's not the form required. And if it is the form required, if I'm wrong, and if you are somehow judged to be liable without a statute to base the liability in, because the court can only enforce what's in the statutes. That's the only subject matter jurisdiction they possess, is to enforce authorized statutes. If there's no statute that makes you liable, they can't enforce an imaginary liability that the IRS dreams up because they can't find a statute, so they just make it up. And there's no return requirement that can be identified in law anymore because they removed the entries when the information I just showed you started defeating them at trial in courts during the 1990s. Rather than continue to be defeated and have the law exposed in plain sight for everyone to see that they blatantly violate, they removed it. So you can't look up anymore what requirement. Well, if it's not in the law, the court can't enforce it. The court can't get to a 1040 as required. And even if they do decide somehow that a 1040 was required and you were supposed to file it, there's no statute that says you have to file it. 6001 says a return is required from a person that's liable, and 6020B says if you don't file it, the secretary is supposed to file it for you. So if anybody fails the requirement to file a return, it's the secretary. You can't be charged for failure to file. It's the secretary who failed to file if there was no return. There's no statute that makes you the person responsible for the return. There's a statute that says if you're liable, you're supposed to file, but they can't show liability. They also can't identify in law what it is you're supposed to file. This is all based on the assumption, based on the de facto behavior of a society since the end of World War II. They send 1040 to the post office, and like good little lemmings, everyone's supposed to run down to the post office, pick up their return, give up their Fourth Amendment right, give up their Fifth Amendment right, give up their right to work, give up the fruits of their labor worked all year, give up their ability to move themselves forward through the use, utilization, and expenditure of those fruits of labor stolen from them, and serve the government who is destroying your liberty, your freedom, your rights, your property, your law, your system, your people, your states. Destroying the country with this reckless and fraudulent borrowing and spending. This is how you stop it. This is how you stop it. Stop being the lemming. Make the secretary do the work. She can't fill out 100 million return. And they don't. They're not authorized to use a Form 1020 under 6020B. Should we look at that? I guess we probably should. What forms are you authorized to use? Well, here you go. Here's from the Federal Register. Our records indicate that the Internal Revenue Service has not incorporated by reference in the Federal Register, as that term is defined in the Federal Register system, a requirement to make an income tax return. Doesn't exist. Here's the authority the Secretary assists. They can assess taxes which have not been duly paid by stamp or shown on return. Is that why they want you to voluntarily file a return? They can't assess it unless you give them the return? Oh, and let's look. Here's the Internal Revenue Manual. Refusal to file IRC 6020B. Assessment procedure. Scope. The procedure applies to employment, excise, and partnership tax returns. Generally, the following returns. Not generally, always, and I'll prove it in a minute. Employment, excise, and partnership. Does that say personal Form 1040? No, it doesn't. It doesn't say personal returns. It says employment, excise, and partnership. And look at the forms. 940, employer's annual federal unemployment. 941, quarterly federal tax. 942, employer's quarterly tax. 942, employer's annual tax for agriculture. Form 11B, special tax return gaming devices. Form 720, quarterly federal excise. Form 2290, federal use tax return. Form CT1, employer's annual railroad retirement. Form 1065, U.S. partnership return of income. 1040 isn't on the list. This is from the Internal Revenue Manual instructing the Internal Revenue agents on the proper procedure to proceed under 6020B and creating a substitute return where one is required. Here's more evidence. Form 1040 isn't required. It's not one of the forms authorized to be used by the Secretary under 6020B, where she's required to produce and file and sign the return. And here, the delegation order, DDOKC 150, Oklahoma City District. It doesn't matter what district it is because the law has to be the same in all 50 states. It can't be one way, this way in Oklahoma, and any other way in any other state. It has to be exactly the same in all 50 states, or it violates the rule of geographical uniformity, which says the tax has to be the same in all 50 states. And here again, we're addressing Section 6020B. And the authority to execute returns. Authority is redelegated to revenue officers, so the Secretary doesn't have to file the return. The IRS does. Revenue officers GS9 and above to prepare and execute the following returns on behalf of the District Director under 6020B. Again, the same list: 940, 941, 942, 943, 11B, 720, 2290, CT1, 1065. Form 1040 isn't authorized. Not required by law, and they're not authorized to use it. The Secretary can't use it, and the revenue officers can't use it in doing a 6020B assessment. The whole thing's a fraud. Oh, and look, under 6020B, they told in 2000, testifying to the Senate Investigating Committee on Finance, chaired by Senator Moynihan, look at what they said. Customer Service Division's officials commented on the phrase substitute for return. They asked us to emphasize that even though the program is commonly referred to as the SFR program, no actual tax return is prepared. No actual tax return is prepared. Instead, these officials noted that the IRS prepares a document that substitutes for the return and that proposes an assessment which is posted to the taxpayer's account and is subject to the collection process. Now, where is that in the law? Remember the law? 6020B? Should we go take a look at it? 6020B, and what does 6020B2 say? Here we are, IRS 6020. A, by the way, says that if the taxpayer is willing to sit down with the IRS and they work together to fill out the return because it was too confusing for the individual, the IRS can help them. And then if the individual signs the return, that's a return. B says if the individual won't help and the IRS has to do it, then the secretary is authorized to make the return where it's required. Unfortunately, 1040 isn't. And 2, status of returns, any return so made. Any return so made and subscribed by the secretary or her delegate shall be prima facie good and sufficient for all legal purposes. Now, here's your evidentiary legal standard. Prima facie means good in the courts, all legal purposes. Here's your standard for legal evidence of an assessment. Assigned 60/20. Assigned 60/20. Nothing else meets this standard. Prima facie, good and sufficient for all legal purposes. But what did the IRS say? No actual return is prepared. The whole thing's a fraud. They're just lying to you to steal your money, to make you servants and good little communist serfs and peons who are used like a $2 whore. The whole thing is a fraud. A monumental fraud. Perpetrated by liberal circuit court judges enforcing their own socialist, communist beliefs. Literally communist beliefs. The second plank of the Communist Manifesto is what's being enforced. A heavy progressive or graduated income tax. Graduated taxation isn't in the Constitution. What's in the Constitution is uniformity of taxation. And there's no uniformity at all in tax brackets. Graduated tax brackets aren't constitutionally authorized for use with citizens. Only the inanimate corporate person and inanimate commodities and articles of commerce subject to tax. So the Supreme Court ruled in the 1880s, graduated tax brackets are based on the power of Congress to discriminate against the corporations, commodities, and articles of commerce subject to tax. But Congress has no power to discriminate against citizens on any basis, including income, not race, not gender, not age, not national origin, not on any basis, including wealth, success in business, prosperity, resulting in earnings. The whole thing's a fraud. No citizen can be charged with failure to file. The law doesn't support it. The Form 1040 is not required, and there's no requirement for anyone to file a return other than the secretary who's supposed to fulfill the duty if someone who was allegedly supposed to failed to. There's no charging them with the penalty. They're charging the secretary because she's the one with the statutory requirement. Everything else is nebulous, nefarious, vague, arbitrary, and capricious. How are you liable if not by statute? The statutes clearly say it applies to people who are liable, which are the tax collectors, the employers of the withholding agents, not the individual wage earner. That liability is inferred. And it doesn't exist until you voluntarily sign the Form 1040. At that point, you make yourself liable for tax that you had no liability in statute to pay because you self-assessed it voluntarily without understanding what you were really doing, which was joining the Communist Party and volunteering to serve their needs at your own expenses. Sacrifice yourself for Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, Schumer, Waters, Adam Schiff. Those, sacrifice everything for them. Donald Trump's trying to give it back to you. He's the one that cut the taxes down at 20% and created the boom. Joe Biden is destroying it. But anyway, I think that brings us to a close on this. I just wanted to make the point the statutes simply don't support any prosecution of individual citizens for a failure to file a Form 1040. It simply doesn't exist in the law. The individual that fails the requirement is the secretary or the IRS agent who has delegated the authority to file for her. And of course, the reason why they won't do it, why they just defraud their computer, deceiving it to say it does, is because the form's not authorized and they're not authorized to use it. So that pretty much draws it to a conclusion. Every single failure to file prosecution for the last 80 years has been a complete and total fraud. And these videos are intended to educate the American people so that they will no longer be victimized by the socialist forces perverting and subverting our government and the enforcement of the law in the courts, which is what's happening. The law is being perverted and subverted by the judges of the liberal circuit courts issuing all this nonsense that came out of the 60s. And we've already seen the Supreme Court deal with a lot of it. They struck down Roe v. Wade. They struck down affirmative action. These are other nonsensical opinions that came out of the socialism of the early 60s, just like these income tax rulings, enforcing it as a direct tax instead of an indirect tax collected as a tariff from non-resident aliens and foreign corporations, or a voluntary tax since 1945 for citizens through the providing of a W-4 because they were indoctrinated into misunderstanding the true nature of the tax and the withholding and what was required and what was not. Surprise! Your government's been lying to you since World War II. Lying to you. Nothing but lying to you. Joe Biden is the penultimate liar. You can always tell Joe's lying because his lips are moving and sound is coming out. Even though you don't understand what it is he's saying, you can be sure he's lying.